Story 1. The narrator recounts their formative years spent within a modest, unremarkable community situated in Nebraska, a span of 18 years during which merely two truly momentous occurrences took place. The initial, and arguably most positive, event was the narrator's own birth, an arrival for which they humorously acknowledged the collective appreciation. Conversely, the subsequent incident, possibly the most dire circumstance to ever befall their hometown, involved Kevin Meyer deliberately igniting his detached garage structure. Alternatively, one might contend that Kevin's actions represented the gravest event that, paradoxically, never fully materialized to devastate their community. If this assertion appears perplexing, the narrator requests patience, promising that complete understanding will unfold throughout the forthcoming textual segments. This particular incident occurred on a Sunday evening, when the narrator was enrolled in their inaugural year of high school, an age bracket during which they and their companions frequently embarked on leisurely bicycle rides during the twilight hours, engaging in what was considered innocent, traditional recreation. As they casually pedaled, they observed a peer from their academic cohort propelling himself along the thoroughfare at an exceedingly rapid velocity. They halted their movement to offer a greeting, and amidst hurried, breathless exclamations, the classmate urgently announced, "Oh my goodness, everyone! The Meyer family's garage is engulfed in flames. Come witness it." Subsequently, they propelled themselves with utmost haste along the street, trailing their classmate until they confronted a ferocious, raging inferno that had formerly constituted the Meyer household's garage structure. However, precisely upon their arrival, law enforcement officers and fire suppression personnel present at the location instantly instructed them to maintain a considerable distance. Believing they were already situated at a secure remove, they experienced a degree of perplexity but nonetheless complied with the directives provided. It was at that juncture that they began to discern numerous popping and banging noises emanating from the garage, prompting the fire suppression team, who had been actively engaged in extinguishing the conflagration, to abruptly seek refuge. The narrator possessed no comprehension regarding the origin of the minor explosive sounds, yet reasoned that if these sounds instilled fear in both the police and the firefighters, then they too ought to be apprehensive. In fact, the narrator genuinely apprehended that the Meyer residence was on the verge of an explosion or similar catastrophic event, a sentiment shared by their companions, which facilitated their swift departure, cycling homeward to recount the occurrences to their respective parents. On the subsequent morning at their educational institution, the entire student body was engaged in discussions concerning the fire, primarily due to Kevin Meyer's conspicuous absence from all his scheduled lessons. Certain students disseminated unsubstantiated reports, asserting that they had observed emergency medical personnel transferring him into an ambulance, claiming he sustained such severe incineration that his body was reduced to a mere smoldering remains. Conversely, other accounts suggested that he, along with his parents, had relocated to reside with extended family members, as the conflagration had rendered their domicile fundamentally uninhabitable. This particular narrative resonated more with the narrator, who presumed that verifiable corroboration would be issued had any fatalities actually occurred. However, by the subsequent morning, conclusive verification materialized. News broadcasts conveyed that fire service operatives had successfully retrieved a single deceased individual from the charred garage structure, while the remaining family members, having sought refuge with relatives, had formally requested the press to afford them privacy. Consequently, on that particular Tuesday, they were cognizant that a death had transpired, yet they possessed no precise knowledge of the deceased's identity. The Meyer household comprised 3 distinct generations residing within the same dwelling, and Kevin himself was one of 4 offspring. A multitude of additional unsubstantiated reports commenced circulating, and it was not until the ensuing day, when their high school's head administrator convened a compulsory special assembly, that they finally received any definitive information. The narrator distinctly recalls the entire student body proceeding into the athletic hall, where the county's chief law enforcement officer and a small contingent of his deputies were positioned before the tiered seating, each displaying an undeniably grave expression upon their countenances. Upon their collective seating, the principal initiated the proceedings by declaring that the county sheriff possessed significant information to impart to them. And as the sheriff advanced and removed his headwear, the narrator asserts that the silence in the room was so profound, one could have perceived the sound of a falling pin. They understood that the subject pertained to the Meyer family, yet the precise nature of the revelation was, in the narrator's earnest estimation, something they would have utterly failed to anticipate, even given an eternity. The narrator disclaims any pretense of being able to recollect the individual's precise verbatim statements, given that these events transpired nearly 2 decades prior, but offers the fundamental essence of his address to the assembled audience. He commenced by acknowledging their collective awareness of the conflagration at the Meyer property, and expressed certainty that they were also apprised of the lamentable casualty that had occurred. He regretfully announced, "Indeed, I apologize for being the bearer of this unfortunate news, but your fellow student, Kevin, is the individual who succumbed." A collective, rippling exhalation of shock permeated the gymnasium, and the sheriff briefly interrupted his discourse before resuming. He proceeded, stating, "At present, we are still endeavoring to ascertain the origin of the fire, and therefore, we solicit anyone possessing any pertinent details concerning Kevin to voluntarily come forward." He clarified, "There is no compulsion to do so immediately. You are at liberty to contact my office at your convenience, and we can conduct a more private discussion. I earnestly implore you, if you possess any information regarding peculiar or atypical conduct displayed by Kevin in the period preceding the conflagration, please do present yourselves." This pronouncement served as their initial indication that something profoundly amiss had transpired. The narrator inferred that the authorities desired to manage the entire situation with extreme delicacy, and fully comprehended their potential motivation to safeguard the students from the unsettling truths they had already uncovered. The immediate collective sentiment was one of absolute astonishment and profound sorrow. The younger generation was appalled that a peer had perished in such a dreadful manner. However, had the law enforcement officials divulged the actual discoveries made within the premises, the narrator speculates that public reaction would have been far less mournful, transitioning instead towards profound indignation. An additional 2 days elapsed before the full veracity of the situation emerged, and by that juncture, the municipal authorities had resolved to delegate the burden of disclosure to the parents of the community. A civic gathering was convened, a memory distinct in the narrator's mind because their parents had requested the completion of household duties prior to their return, only for the parents to spend approximately 2 hours engaged in the game Perfect Dark. Upon their arrival home, the narrator anticipated their displeasure, having made minimal progress on the assigned tasks. Yet, their demeanor conveyed no anger. Instead, their countenances bore expressions that were simultaneously peculiar, sorrowful, and profound, precisely mirroring the visages they exhibited upon the sudden demise of the narrator's grandfather. They seated the narrator in the television lounge and inquired about the extent of their acquaintance with Kevin. The narrator informed them that their familiarity was limited, noting that while they shared a Spanish language class, no direct communication ever transpired between them. Subsequently, they commenced posing a series of additional inquiries, such as whether Kevin had ever displayed anger towards the narrator, or if the narrator held any affection for him, and similar probing questions. Ultimately, the narrator candidly informed their parents that it was self-evident they possessed undisclosed information concerning Kevin, and expressed a preference for direct disclosure, even if it pertained to him having committed self-harm, asserting their maturity to process such realities. As it transpired, the narrator was indeed insufficiently mature to confront the stark reality. Kevin had not ended his own life, but had inadvertently detonated himself while attempting to construct an explosive device. Evidently, his intention was to validate his conceptual approach by fabricating a prototype. However, during the assembly process, he somehow triggered the device, generating a blast powerful enough to cause his demise prior to the conflagration of his garage. Initially, the appearance suggested he might have merely been an incendiary enthusiast, perhaps a pyromaniac, experimenting carelessly with an accelerant. This ambiguity accounted for the several days required by law enforcement to ascertain the precise circumstances of the event. Authorities were compelled to meticulously examine the fire-ravaged garage and sift through Kevin's personal belongings in an effort to comprehend his motivations. The police subsequently discovered a personal journal maintained by Kevin, within which he had, in essence, detailed his scheme to construct an explosive device and place it beneath the ecclesiastical structure on a particular Sunday morning, when it would be populated with numerous families. Law enforcement personnel refrained from disclosing the precise content of the remainder of the journal, revealing only that its perusal proved profoundly unsettling and that it contained multiple allusions to the Columbine massacre, which had transpired in the preceding year. By the conclusion of the discussion, the narrator's mother was weeping, and their father exhibited the most profound state of agitation they had ever witnessed. That adolescent intended to annihilate nearly the entirety of the community, and the narrator emphatically states that had he successfully targeted the church during the impending Veterans Day commemoration, he would have caused the demise of approximately 90% of their town's populace, all in a singular, incendiary detonation. The most comprehensive rationale the narrator ever received for Kevin's motives was simply that the adolescent desired to inflict harm upon others, or that he was not mentally sound. No individual genuinely subjected the youth to bullying or imposed significant hardship upon him. The narrator speculates he was simply insane. Yet, the narrator also expresses gratitude that he did not possess greater intellect, and that he refrained from conducting more thorough research or exercising heightened caution, for had he done so, their entire town could have been utterly eradicated from existence. Story 2. The narrator originates from a compact community situated in the Midwestern United States, and within that settlement resides a quaint, small sanctuary. Behind this charming little chapel, a modest commemorative monument stands, dedicated to a family of 4 individuals who were tragically slain by enigmatic wanderers who subsequently eluded capture. On a particular evening, the entire family was at home when a terrifying intrusion occurred. The assailant proceeded to end the lives of the entire household as they slumbered, the mother, father, son, and daughter, all perishing within a mere handful of minutes of one another. As one might readily surmise, these homicides profoundly shattered the fabric of their compact community. The narrator was merely attending elementary education when the incident transpired, yet retains vivid recollections of the solemn vigil, the funeral rites, and the formal ceremony accompanying the dedication of the chapel's commemorative edifice. It was presented as an utterly arbitrary and preventable catastrophe, an act of malevolence inflicted upon their community by an elusive, external nefarious force. However, this representation diverged from the actual occurrences. The true events are akin to a widely known but unspoken truth, a reality understood by all residents yet vocally acknowledged by none. This pervasive silence exists, ostensibly, to safeguard their community, or so the narrator was informed, though they question how the perpetuation of falsehoods genuinely benefits them. It merely constitutes a superficial covering, a deceptive pretense of rural peace. What true purpose does it serve to feign a quiet, joyful community when the underlying actuality is profoundly divergent from such an image? All right, the narrator acknowledges having protracted the revelation of the true events, and will now proceed directly to the account. On the evening under consideration, the family consumed their evening meal and viewed some television programming. Subsequently, at an unspecified time after 9 p.m., the parents escorted their children to bed. The father characteristically remained awake with a glass of scotch following the mother and children's retirement to bed. He would typically engage in viewing highlights of football or baseball matches, or indulge in several late-night television programs, activities deemed quintessential paternal pursuits. However, he never rose from the sofa on that particular night. The entire official narrative maintained that the family had been murdered during their sleep, a statement that, from a technical standpoint, held factual accuracy. Yet, the portrayal consistently depicted them as peacefully slumbering in their respective beds at the time of their demise, a depiction that is, in fact, inaccurate. Several hours prior to the homicides, the family had convened for their evening meal. The narrator is unaware of the precise dish consumed, be it chicken pot pie or an alternative, but is certain of the dessert choice, as on that day, the family's 9-year-old daughter had prepared for everyone a quantity of strawberry cream-flavored gelatinous pudding. As the narrator conceptualized it, the dessert was likely not the most delectable they had ever encountered. The narrator muses that if their own child displayed an apparent interest in culinary arts, baking, or indeed any creative endeavor, they would feign enthusiastic approval and consume the entire serving. After all, what does it matter if the powder-to-liquid proportion was slightly incorrect, or if an excessive quantity of sugar was added to an already sweet concoction? However, the sole reason for its peculiar taste was that the 9-year-old female child had incorporated an abundant quantity of maximum-strength cold medication into the pudding mixture. The narrator does not possess exact knowledge of the precise amount she added, nor the exact quantity consumed by the parents and brother, yet acknowledges that the dosage was sufficient to render them largely unconscious, thereby enabling the daughter to execute her preconceived scheme. It becomes clear, therefore, that the explanation for the perpetual evasion of capture by the enigmatic, itinerant vagrant murderer, who supposedly elected to arbitrarily infiltrate and slay the family, is simply that such an individual never existed. Once her family members had all succumbed to unconsciousness, the young girl proceeded to the kitchen and retrieved a substantial, aged knife from either a utensil drawer or a knife block. She then entered the television room where her father lay sleeping on the sofa, and proceeded to sever his throat. According to the accounts shared with the narrator, she inflicted a cut so profound and expansive upon his throat that he was rendered incapable of vocalizing a scream. His sole action was to press his hands against the injury, presumably questioning the reason for the assault, though he would have expired within a matter of minutes. Following this, she ascended to the upper floor and perpetrated identical acts upon her mother and brother, effectively dismembering them directly within their sleeping quarters. These harrowing events, incidentally, transpired on a Friday evening, and no one harbored any suspicion of wrongdoing until Sunday morning, when none of the family members appeared at their religious service. Even at that point, however, valid reasons for their non-attendance could have existed. Perhaps they were out of town, visiting relatives, or had spontaneously embarked on a vacation. Furthermore, this particular community is characterized by an intricate familiarity with one another's affairs, yet its inhabitants also possess the prudence to refrain from undue interference in each other's private matters, if such a distinction can be comprehended. The crucial aspect is that no individual made an in-person visit to this family's residence until Monday afternoon, approximately 50-odd hours subsequent to the commission of the homicides. The children had failed to appear at their school, the parents had not reported to their respective places of employment, and from the narrator's comprehension, the police effectively spent the morning correlating information until it became evident that the entire family was unaccounted for. Unsurprisingly, the primary location for investigation was the residence itself, prompting a pair of county sheriff's deputies to arrive there to ascertain their well-being. The precise nature of their discovery remains a subject of intense contention among the inhabitants of their community, with accounts varying, depending on the individual consulted. One of three distinct scenarios is purported to have transpired. The initial hypothesis posits that the 9-year-old female child had committed self-harm after fully grasping the profound implications of her actions. Subsequently, the entire incident was reportedly suppressed solely to avert the distressing scrutiny of the media that such a case would inevitably attract. This represents the most straightforward elucidation, and while the principle of Occam's razor suggests it should be accepted, the narrator does not personally subscribe to this version of events. The narrator comprehends the motivations behind a desire for concealment. The public dissemination of such a horrific event would undoubtedly fragment a compact community like theirs. Nonetheless, atrocities of that magnitude transpire far more frequently than one might wish to concede, and information invariably becomes publicly known. Therefore, the question arises, what aspects of these homicides were so utterly dreadful, even beyond their inherent horror, that they compelled individuals to maintain absolute silence concerning them? For instance, in the narrator's own situation, they believe they might be the inaugural individual to ever disclose such details to an external party, yet even so, the pervasive culture of reticence, seemingly ingrained into their very genetic makeup, precludes them from fully divulging specific names, dates, or geographical locations. This restraint stems from the apprehension that any resulting repercussions, such as media sensationalism or potential punitive judicial outcomes, would ultimately be attributable to their disclosure. Nevertheless, returning to the presumed occurrences, the first alternative hypothesis suggests that upon the police's forced entry, the girl feigned being the sole survivor, deceiving the officers into approaching her closely, then attempting to assault them. The law enforcement officials attempted to safely apprehend her, but she possessed the identical knife she had employed to slay her parents, and amidst the ensuing disorder, one of the officers discharged a firearm, striking her, at least according to the narrator's conjecture. This scenario is assuredly the less provocative of the two alternative conjectures, yet it is not the one that resonates most plausibly with the narrator. The narrator finds credible the notion of an overzealous, inexperienced officer reacting instinctively to the sight of a knife and prioritizing self-preservation, but struggles to believe the inability to subdue a 9-year-old female child. They express serious doubt regarding this aspect. No proponent of that theory was geographically proximate enough to the family's dwelling to have heard any gunshot, and regardless of whether the officer was an impetuous newcomer, the narrator refuses to accept that emergency medical technicians would not have been summoned after the shooting of a 9-year-old child. Subsequently, once county-level emergency medical personnel become involved, the prospect of a clandestine cover-up dissipates entirely due to the extensive bureaucratic documentation necessitated. And then there exists a second, distinct alternative hypothesis, which postulates that emergency medical technicians were not summoned because all individuals were already deceased upon the law enforcement officer's entry into the residence. No one observed the 9-year-old daughter at any juncture throughout that entire weekend, indicating that she did not depart the domicile to acquire provisions, frequent a dining establishment, or undertake any similar external activities. Therefore, a compelling query arises: what sustenance did she consume, and by what means did she meet her end? According to certain narrators, the response to both inquiries is profoundly disturbing, and what is most distressing is that they converge upon a singular answer. That a 9-year-old child perished subsequent to an attempt to consume portions of her deceased father's remains. Her demise resulted from the severe illness induced by endeavoring to ingest her own paternal figure, an illness so debilitating that she was unable to retain any sustenance, including water. The narrator, not being a medical professional, cannot definitively state the precise physiological mechanism by which such an action would prove fatal, perhaps through severe dehydration. However, by the time the law enforcement officer forcibly entered the family's rear entrance on that Monday afternoon, the young girl was deceased, found lying amidst a pool of her own emesis and liquid excrement. The narrator acknowledges the remarkably fortuitous coincidence that both law enforcement officers who discovered the family subsequently retired and relocated from the town a short time thereafter. Consequently, the sole two individuals privy to the complete truth simply departed without providing any means of future contact. Yet, concurrently, the narrator comprehends why two relatively inexperienced officers from a compact community might simply have been unable to psychologically process the horrific scene they encountered on that day. Indeed, if the second alternative hypothesis were to be genuinely credited, witnessing such a spectacle would undoubtedly suffice to induce profound mental derangement. As one might readily infer, this subject matter is not something the narrator can freely discuss with numerous individuals. They and their high school companions occasionally conversed about it, but invariably in subdued whispers and never in public spaces where older residents might overhear them. Now that the narrator's parents have deceased and they reside in a distinctly different location, it is not feasible to simply return to the community and commence posing inquiries. They would merely encounter the same barrier of silence previously observed whenever inquiries were made about the events, eliciting responses such as, "A dreadful tragedy. What a pity," or, hopefully, "They apprehend the culprit one day." Then, at some future point, when all individuals privy to the authentic narrative have passed away, the reassuring fabrications propagated concerning these homicides will simply transmute into yet another rendition of the truth. All that malevolence, which permeated the corporeal form of a 9-year-old female child, will ultimately be consigned to oblivion. And perhaps, just perhaps, that outcome is precisely what must transpire. Story 3. The narrator's family possesses a rustic log cabin situated just beyond the periphery of a compact, single traffic light settlement known as Marble, located in North Carolina. It functions as a type of familial legacy, an asset they are disinclined to divest themselves of, primarily because it marks the ancestral genesis of their lineage. Moreover, the narrator believes an additional factor contributing to its retention is the immensely compelling narrative intrinsically linked to this specific locale. While intriguing to an impartial onlooker, it undoubtedly proved profoundly terrifying for the narrator's grandmother, who was the individual who genuinely endured the experience. Thus, the setting is the summer of 1998, a period predating the narrator's birth by 2 years, with their grandmother residing autonomously at the aforementioned cabin. The narrator's grandfather had passed away prior to their birth, yet nearly every summer throughout their shared life, their grandparents would journey to that cabin and simply spend a fortnight in isolation, with only squirrels as companions. Subsequent to her husband's demise, she perpetuated the tradition as a coping mechanism for her sorrow, which explains her solitary presence at the cabin around June or July of 1998. Currently, while no television was present at the remote location, she did possess an antiquated radio device, which she utilized to enjoy vintage radio dramas broadcast on what is now an obsolete transmission channel. The broadcasting outlet, in common with many others, customarily interspersed its programming with brief intervals for news updates, and on one particular day, she became aware of a series of explosive devices that had been detonating in Georgia and Alabama. Law enforcement authorities had identified a suspect whom they desired to interview, but he had absconded and was potentially concealing himself within the hilly terrain of his native state, North Carolina, as one might correctly infer. The news reporter then furnished a concise physical description of the suspect, noting his approximate medium height, dark hair, and somewhat light-colored eyes, and stated the individual's name as Eric Rudolph. The narrator's grandmother often recounted that the name resonated with her primarily due to its association with the festive Christmas carol featuring the reindeer, and she consequently found herself inadvertently whistling the melody, despite the superstition against such an action during the height of summer. In any event, several hours elapsed, the sun set, and the grandmother was leisurely relaxing within the cabin, engaged in typical grandmotherly activities. Unexpectedly, a sharp rap resounded upon the entrance. The grandmother was not anticipating any visitors, and her sole neighbors resided approximately a mile distant along the road. Thus, it was with justifiable apprehension that she arose and proceeded towards the cabin's primary entry point. Upon unlatching the door, she observed a male individual of average stature, adorned with a baseball cap, possessing somewhat light-colored eyes and a dark, facial hair growth above his upper lip. The grandmother, being inherently benevolent, extended a polite salutation for a pleasant evening and inquired how she might be of assistance to him. He responded with a polite, "Good evening, ma'am," before adding, "I sincerely apologize for intruding upon you, but I must request a modest favor." He proceeded to inquire if the grandmother possessed any surplus provisions she could share, explaining that he too owned a cabin in the vicinity and had arrived to inspect his property, but due to departing directly after work and neglecting to acquire foodstuffs for his retreat, he found himself without provisions for the duration of the night. As the grandmother recounted the incident, the man exhibited such remarkable politeness towards her that she instinctively extended an invitation for him to enter, without fully considering the implications. She habitually maintained her larder fully supplied with a diverse array of dried and preserved foodstuffs, ensuring she perpetually had surplus items. She narrated that as she was engaged in filling the man's knapsack with dried meat and canned peaches, she suddenly glanced up at him and paused her actions. The grandmother then interjected, "I did not ascertain your name." He responded with a polite, "My name is Bobby, ma'am." The grandmother pressed, "Bobby who?" The man then stated, "Bobby Randolph," reiterating the surname, Randolph. She affirmed that the name immediately triggered a sense of alarm within her consciousness. While not precisely Rudolph, it was disconcertingly proximate, sufficiently so to induce a profound sense of unease in the deepest part of her being. It is crucial to recall that this occurred long before the advent of mobile cellular telephones, and the cabin itself lacked even a fixed landline connection. The most potent method of external communication the grandmother possessed was, rather surprisingly, a signal flare pistol, and if her predicament was as dire as she perceived, such a device would prove entirely inadequate. Consequently, the grandmother opted to feign ignorance. She reasoned that if she simply pretended not to comprehend the implications, provided the man with provisions, and allowed him to depart, she could then drive into the nearest settlement at the earliest opportunity in the morning and inform the authorities of the individual who had visited her cabin. However, just as she was preparing to courteously request his departure, he interjected with a statement to the effect of, "Actually, I have one more modest request. Do you happen to have any accommodation where I might rest for the duration of the night?" The narrator's grandmother consistently described a moment of intense impasse, during which she met Bobby's gaze, perceived the fierce desperation in his eyes, and exerted her utmost effort to maintain her composure as she uttered, "I regret to inform you, I simply do not possess any available lodging." At that instant, Bobby reached inside his jacket, extracted a handgun, and conveyed a statement akin to, "I apologize, I was rather hoping you would not articulate that," subsequently gesturing towards the firearm and admonishing, "Do not compel me to employ this weapon." And for those listeners who have not yet deduced the truth, the individual at her threshold was not the Bobby Randolph or any other contrived, foolish pseudonym he had offered her. The man physically present within her cabin was none other than Eric Rudolph, the notorious perpetrator of the Olympic Park bombing himself. The grandmother described this as among the most terrifying encounters of her entire existence, yet not for the reasons one might immediately presume. One must understand, she asserted that she harbored no fear of impending death. Being in her mid-70s at that juncture, the narrator believed she had long ago reconciled her affairs with a higher power. Instead, she stated that the truly frightening aspect was the man's strangely ordinary demeanor. Even after his metaphorical disguise was shed, he continued to be courteous and amiable with the narrator's grandmother, and even extended an offer to assist with household duties and other tasks on the following morning. Naturally, she informed him that she was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs, and unequivocally did not wish for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to entertain the notion that she had consented to his overnight presence. Nevertheless, despite his true identity, he bore no resemblance to the deranged psychopath she had envisioned subsequent to hearing the news broadcast. The narrator's grandmother often recounted that the sole occasion when he truly offered an indication of his authentic self or his past actions was during the invocation of grace before their evening meal. She could never precisely recall his exact words, only that they pertained to the concept of how the righteous shall ultimately triumph. This was an individual who had recently attempted to lethally injure literally hundreds of people through a sequence of horrendous explosive assaults. Thus, the narrator can comprehend why hearing him essentially characterize himself as righteous, profoundly unsettled her. Indeed, the mere contemplation of sharing an evening meal with him unnerves the narrator. They doubt they would have been capable of consuming even a single morsel. Consequently, it may not be astonishing to learn that the grandmother consumed very little of her meal. Additionally, she experienced minimal slumber throughout that night. She occupied the bed, while Eric seemingly took the floor, and throughout the entire duration, she anticipated the abrupt sound of helicopter rotor blades, imagining a searchlight mounted on an aerial vehicle illuminating the house with the intensity of a theatrical stage. Alas, no agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation appeared, and she stated that she must have eventually drifted into a light sleep, because suddenly it was daylight outdoors, and Eric was conspicuously absent. She recounted being so utterly fatigued by the entire ordeal that for a brief moment, she meandered about the cabin, questioning, "Did I merely dream that?" It was then that she discovered a note on a kitchen surface, inscribed in pencil, which simply stated, "Thank you. God bless." And at that moment, she was certain that the encounter had genuinely transpired. The narrator acknowledges that this narrative deviates from a conventional scary story, primarily because despite the necessity of sharing her rustic dwelling with a confirmed perpetrator of monstrous acts, they do not believe their grandmother was ever in any substantial peril. Perhaps had she attempted to contact law enforcement, or in some manner compelled him to a confrontation, then conceivably he might have inflicted harm upon her. However, she was elderly and posed no genuine menace to him, and he was well aware that the cabin lacked any telephone line or similar communication infrastructure, otherwise, he would not have appeared there in the first instance. She herself articulated that she harbored no fear of mortality, and she possessed a subtle intuition that he had no intention of physically harming her. Yet, similar to her, the element that most unnerves the narrator and their sister concerning their grandmother's intimate encounter is the remarkably ordinary demeanor the man exhibited. Humans tend to conceptualize terrorists and individuals of their ilk as depraved, malevolent, and devoid of spirit, monstrous entities that perpetually fester in their own animosity throughout the day. While this may hold true for certain among them, the unsettling notion that the most wicked individuals among humanity are fundamentally akin to ourselves, that, indeed, is what profoundly frightens the narrator. Story 4. The central region of New Mexico encompasses a compact community distinguished by a somewhat unconventional designation. Originally christened Hot Springs, the settlement officially altered its name in the year 1950, subsequent to a well-known radio personality declaring his intention to broadcast his program's 10th anniversary installment from the inaugural municipality that adopted his show's nomenclature. Thus, on the 31st day of March in 1950, Hot Springs formally rebranded itself as Truth or Consequences, and the celebratory 10th anniversary broadcast of the radio program was indeed hosted within its boundaries on the subsequent evening. Truth or Consequences, or T&C, as it is occasionally abbreviated, accommodated a mere 4,700 inhabitants at that time, and its population has not precisely experienced a dramatic surge since. Nevertheless, beginning in 1970, the populace has been consistently increasing. However, during the decade spanning from 2000 to 2010, the town experienced its inaugural population contraction in over 4 decades, with close to 1,000 individuals relocating to other locales. Consequently, what underlying factor could be responsible for such a precipitous decrease in the town's populace? It is conceivable that the phenomenon is related to an individual named David Parker Ray. Born on the 6th of November in the year 1939, in the locality of Bell, New Mexico, David and his elder sister, Peggy, were raised under the guardianship of their paternal grandfather. Their father was an alcoholic, and moreover, a violent one, frequently engaging with the children while inebriated. David recounted a particular occasion when his father presented him with an adult-themed periodical that featured disturbing, violent illustrations. Understandably, David longed for the companionship of his estranged father, and considering that the magazine constituted one of the scant presents his father had ever bestowed upon him, he regarded it with profound affection. The highly susceptible young boy became thoroughly engrossed by these depicted scenes, and, akin to any male child of his developmental stage, he aspired to emulate his paternal figure. The assimilation of such notions into David's psychological framework proved profoundly detrimental to his social maturation, as he discovered it utterly impracticable to articulate the thoughts within his mind to his contemporaries who attended the proximate Mountaineer High School. This pervasive social discomfort resulted in David becoming a target of harassment by a small contingent of his classmates, a circumstance that further exacerbated his deeply entrenched personal difficulties. Subsequent to completing his secondary education, David enrolled in the United States Army, serving as a general mechanic within the Motor Pool Division, prior to his eventual honorable release from service. During this period of his life, David entered into and dissolved 4 marital unions. While the precise reasons for each of these divorces remain ambiguous, it is patently clear that he encountered substantial impediments in sustaining intimate romantic partnerships. In the months succeeding his ultimate, and arguably most acrimonious, marital dissolution, David Parker Ray experienced a form of existential crisis akin to a midlife reckoning, subsequently investing in excess of $100,000 into a distinctive endeavor he would eventually designate as the Toy Box. This toy box comprised a modified semi-trailer, presenting an unadorned white exterior, yet its internal configuration was profoundly intricate and far from simplistic. Ray had allocated a substantial portion of that $100,000 to completely soundproof the trailer, in addition to rendering the structure nearly impervious and utterly impossible to escape from. He subsequently expended another considerable sum on an antiquated gynecological examination chair, of the type typically employed by specialized medical practitioners to ascertain the overall welfare and physiological integrity of a female's reproductive anatomy. The chair originally featured integrated leg supports, components which David ingeniously adapted to function more as restrictive leg restraints. Upon one internal wall of the trailer, David affixed a tool display rack, furnishing it with a diverse assortment of implements including whips, chains, pulleys, straps, clamps, surgical blades, saws, and even specialized leg shackles designed to forcibly maintain a person's legs in an open, spread position. David had additionally equipped the trailer with a selection of implements designed for inflicting torment, such as a mobile electrical generator employed for electroshock torture, and meticulous schematics illustrating various methodologies and procedures for administering the most extreme degree of physical anguish. Even when considering such an unsettling assortment of implements and devices, perhaps the singularly most disquieting feature of the Toy Box was the undeniable reality that David had fundamentally transformed the entire overhead surface into a singular, vast reflective pane. His desire was not merely to inflict prolonged periods of torment and abuse upon his victims, but also to ensure they were compelled to observe the events unfolding upon themselves. Over the span from 1957 to 1999, David Parker Ray is reported to have abducted, subjected to torture, and fatally assaulted as many as 60 distinct women and young girls, with the overwhelming majority being inhabitants of Sierra County, New Mexico. The actions he perpetrated upon these individuals are, candidly, beyond description, and it is conjectured that numerous victims simply succumbed to death as a consequence of the savage torture, long before Ray harbored any deliberate intent to end their lives. He openly admitted to unleashing canines upon his captives, administering them a concoction of sedatives and hallucinogenic substances to intensify their dread, prior to subjecting them to protracted periods of agony and abuse. When he grew dispassionate towards his captives, David would inject them with a compound comprising sodium pentothal and phenobarbital, an amnesiac formulation specifically engineered to fundamentally expunge their recollections. Subsequently, he would transport them from the mountainous regions to the desert, forcibly remove them from his vehicle, and then proceed to conceptualize his next kidnapping. According to David's own testimony, he repeatedly executed this pattern of behavior, employing a straightforward yet efficacious operational method involving either frequenting a proximate drinking establishment to contaminate his victims' beverages, or feigning the identity of a police officer to effectuate a spurious apprehension. This strategy proved successful on numerous occasions, and if his admissions are indeed credible, David Parker Ray is likely the most extensively active serial perpetrator in the annals of American history. However, his dominion of dread abruptly ceased when he encountered a particular victim who would ultimately demonstrate considerably greater fortitude than the majority of his previous targets. Her full designation is Cynthia Vigil A.R. Emilio. During March of 1999, Cynthia was accosted by David in the parking area of the Cerulean Springs Lounge in the neighboring community of Elephant Butte. The narrator clarifies they are not disparaging Cynthia or her past decisions, but there is a strong probability she consented when David propositioned her for pecuniary compensation, as she displayed no resistance or voiced no objection when he declared himself an undercover law enforcement agent and informed her she was being apprehended for soliciting escort services. David subsequently positioned Cynthia in the rear compartment of his automobile, where she must have presumed he intended to transport her to a proximate police station. Consequently, one can only conjure the profound terror she experienced upon discerning that she was being conveyed to truth or consequences and the concealed toy box that was situated, surprisingly, in plain view. If Cynthia did not commence resisting upon seeing the trailer's exterior, she indubitably experienced extreme panic once her gaze fell upon the atrocities contained within its confines. Subsequently, either by employing a type of incapacitating agent or through sheer physical coercion, Ray rendered Cynthia unconscious, then proceeded to secure her in the adapted gynecological examination chair. Upon regaining consciousness, Cynthia perceived the audible output of a tape recording device disseminating a pre-recorded message, which proved to be the distinct voice of David Parker Ray. "Greetings," articulated the recording, "are you currently at ease?" He continued, "I grasp the situation, your wrists and ankles are bound by chains, you are gagged, your vision obscured, feeling disoriented and, I presume, also experiencing fright, conditions perfectly normal given the present circumstances. However, for a brief duration, at minimum, you must compose yourself and attend to this audio recording." He proceeded to explain, "I am not privy to the precise specifics of your apprehension, as this recording is being produced on July 23, 1993, serving as a general informational message for prospective female captives, but its content is predicated upon my extensive experience managing captives over a span of multiple years. Presently, you are unmistakably here without your consent, and you are likely experiencing either profound fear or intense rage. I am confident that you have already endeavored to liberate your wrists and ankles, but your efforts are futile, as you have been seized and transported here for the purpose of our training and utilization of you as a subservient being. This concept may seem rather outlandish, correct? And indeed, I concede it likely does to those unacquainted with such practices, yet we engage in it habitually. It will necessitate considerable adaptation on your behalf, and you will undoubtedly find it disagreeable, but that aspect holds no concern for me. You shall be retained in bonds, akin to an animal, and exploited until a juncture we deem appropriate. My female associate and I exercise extreme discretion when we apprehend a young woman for these specific objectives. It is self-evident that you possess an admirable physique and youth. The female companion to whom David alluded in this context was named Cindy Hendy, who subsequently received a penal sentence of 36 years for her complicity in the torment perpetrated within the toy box. Hendy frequently functioned as a form of reconnaissance agent, identifying susceptible young females whose disappearance might not be readily noticed. She also engaged in the torturous acts intermittently, though her level of sadism was considerably less extreme than that exhibited by David Parker Ray. At this juncture, David elucidated to his captives that their standing was no greater than that of one of the canines, or indeed, one of the livestock residing in the barn, the recording proceeded to declare. And similar to the remainder of our creatures, you will be provided with sustenance and hydration, and maintained in a tolerably hygienic state. We acquire 4 or 5 distinct young women annually, contingent upon our inclinations. We are perpetually vigilant. On occasion, some charming young female will experience a vehicle breakdown at the roadside, or be observed walking, cycling, or jogging. Whenever such an opportune moment arises, and it does not entail excessive risk, we will seize her, even if we already possess a captive in the playroom. After all, diversity lends zest to existence. Although you will prove highly entertaining to interact with, I will eventually grow weary of your presence. However, if I were to eliminate every female we abducted, cadavers would be dispersed across the entire nation. I am disinclined to fatally harm a female unless it is demonstrably imperative, therefore I have conceived a secure, alternative means of disposition. After we have fully completed our engagement with you, you will be heavily sedated with a compound of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital, both potent hypnotic pharmaceuticals that will render you exceptionally vulnerable to hypnosis, self-hypnosis, and suggestive influence. Subsequent to that, you will be maintained in a narcotized state for a few days while I manipulate your cognitive processes. By the time I have completed the process of reconditioning your mind, you will retain no recollection whatsoever of this brief escapade. You will possess no memory of this location, of us, or of the occurrences that transpired upon you. And no deoxyribonucleic acid evidence will remain, as you will undergo a thorough cleansing bath. Following that, you will be clothed, tranquilized, and released onto a rural thoroughfare, experiencing bruising and general bodily soreness, but sustaining no injuries that will not recuperate within 1 or 2 weeks. The prospect of undergoing cognitive reconditioning may not be appealing to you, but we have engaged in this practice for an extended duration, and it proves effective. Furthermore, it represents the lesser of 2 undesirable alternatives. I am confident that you would favor that outcome in preference to suffering strangulation or having your throat severed. Precisely when one might believe the audio recording has reached its zenith of unsettling content, David commences to expound upon the extreme unlikelihood of his captive's successful rescue. Undoubtedly, someone will commence a search for your whereabouts. There may even be an official missing persons report filed, he declared, prior to asserting, however, no one will be seeking you here. There will be no valiant rescuers arriving to liberate you. You are unequivocally left to your own devices. Regarding the prospect of escape, I am certain you will endeavor to devise a means, as that is inherent to human disposition. Consequently, you shall be confined within surroundings more impregnable than a conventional penitentiary cell. A collar fashioned from steel will be secured around your neck with a padlock. This is attached to a lengthy, substantial chain that is, in turn, padlocked to a floor anchor. This neck restraint will remain affixed until such time as you are released. It constitutes an unremovable apparatus. As I have previously stated, you will receive regular sustenance and hydration, not in abundance, but sufficient to maintain your health. During the initial days, until you become accustomed to it, you will experience a sense of physical feebleness and perpetual hunger. However, I favor maintaining you in a debilitated state regardless. I comprehend that being forcibly abducted and compelled into servitude is a difficult reality to accept. Some young women indeed encounter considerable distress with this, and I am confident you will likewise. Nevertheless, confront the truth. You cannot escape, you cannot refuse, you will be utterly incapable of struggling or resisting. A terrifying notion, certainly, but you possess no alternative but to endure it. The regulations are few in number and exceedingly simple to commit to memory, yet you will inevitably commit errors, as every subservient individual does. However, I have an aversion to habitual transgressors. It incites considerable displeasure within me. Some young women exhibit a tendency towards recalcitrance, and I would certainly counsel against such behavior, as it will lead to severe repercussions for you. Should it become requisite, I possess the capability to inflict actions upon your physical form and subject you to torment in manners that surpass your wildest imaginings. The designated playroom is furnished with a comprehensive array of surgical implements, which I have had cause to employ previously and will again, as circumstances demand. If you attempt to bite me, I shall extract your teeth with forceps. If you scratch me, I shall forcibly remove your fingernails. This may seem severe and unfeeling, but if you cause us excessive difficulty, or if you present any form of menace to us, I will harbor no reservations whatsoever about severing your throat. Towards the conclusion of the recording, David appears to adopt a disturbingly comforting, and perhaps even encouraging, inflection, admonishing his captive to persevere and survive. Be compliant, maintain silence, assimilate the regulations, and survive, he commanded. Regardless of the intensity of the pain, no action we intend to inflict upon your physical being will result in any grave or irreversible injury. I am not deceiving you or attempting to simplify the experience, as such an endeavor would be futile. I am merely conveying the factual reality to you as it exists. Regarding needles, they will consistently be rendered sterile. The clamps will induce discomfort, but they will not occasion any lasting physical impairment. They do not even lacerate the dermal layer. David then concludes his message with the exhortation, simply endure it one day at a time, exercise prudence, and embody a survivor. Never utter a scream, refrain from speaking without explicit authorization, maintain extreme quietude, be submissive and compliant, and by all means, exhibit due deference. Have a pleasant day. One can only conceive of the profound dread Cynthia must have experienced, having been compelled to assimilate such a horrifying recording, and for the subsequent 72 hours, she was subjected to some of the most appalling physical and mental torment conceivable. On the third day of her incarceration, David was obliged to attend his employment, and consequently entrusted Cynthia into the custody of his confederate, Cindy Hendy. At an unspecified moment, Cindy proceeded into an adjacent compartment of the trailer to respond to a telephone communication, thereby leaving her captive momentarily unattended. By that juncture, Hendy had grown excessively complacent regarding Cynthia's subservience, and in a flash of sudden, intense awareness, Cynthia observed that her captor had placed the keys to her restraints on a proximate surface, precisely within her grasp. She extended her arm towards the keys, carefully lifting them from the table with the utmost silence, preparatory to endeavoring her self-liberation. However, precisely as Cynthia was initiating her bid for freedom, Cindy Hendy re-entered the compartment, erupting into a furious rage upon witnessing the unfolding events. A ferocious altercation immediately commenced, with the two females clawing and biting one another amidst the clanking of chains and the violent rocking of the trailer. Cindy succeeded in extricating herself from Cynthia's hold momentarily, seizing a proximate lighting fixture before forcibly shattering it upon Cynthia's cranium. The incarcerated woman was disoriented and wounded, yet in that fleeting respite, she too had managed to grasp an implement, and when Cindy again lunged towards her, Cynthia thrust an ice pick deeply into her captor's cervical region. Cindy collapsed onto the ground, emitting a gurgling sound as sanguine fluid seeped into her respiratory passage, but Cynthia displayed no hesitation. She unfastened her restraints, removed the padlocks from the entrance of the toy box, and then dashed with utmost speed towards the closest highway, clad solely in the steel servitude collar that David had compelled her to wear. Cynthia promptly reached the abode of a compassionate stranger, who welcomed her, contacted law enforcement authorities, and subsequently offered her solace while awaiting their arrival. This marked the conclusion of a 3-day ordeal, a nightmare from which she would never entirely recuperate, yet, fortunately, her courageous evasion heralded the termination of David's decade-spanning spree of violence. Law enforcement utilized Cynthia's sworn statement to rapidly pinpoint the precise whereabouts of the toy box, subsequently taking both David and Cindy into official detention. They underwent detention, interrogation, and formal accusation. However, during the progression of the police inquiry, a startling network of familial complicity was brought to light. David Parker Ray had, in fact, recorded the torment inflicted upon some of his victims on video, thereby amassing a deeply disturbing collection of self-produced horror cinematics. These recordings were ostensibly intended for future generations, yet they ultimately served as incriminating exhibits against him. One of the young women captured on a videotape dating from 1996 was identified as Kelly Garrett, whom police successfully located and apprehended due to a distinctive tattoo on her ankle. Kelly subsequently informed law enforcement that on the particular evening of her abduction, she had engaged in an argument with her spouse and resolved to socialize at a drinking establishment with companions. Among these friends was an individual named Jesse, and Jesse serendipitously happened to be the biological offspring of David Parker Ray. Jesse was not only David's progeny but also his confederate, and she later confessed to intentionally escorting Kelly to the Cerulean Springs Lounge, which served as her father's preferred location for targeting victims. While at the establishment, Jesse adulterated Kelly's beverage with intoxicating substances furnished by her father, and as Kelly stumbled outdoors, experiencing nausea and dizziness, she was rendered insensate by a strike from her rear. Subsequent to days of torment, Kelly only managed to escape because David concluded he had exceeded appropriate limits and had tortured his victim to the point of fatality. However, upon perceiving that she retained vital signs, he lacerated her throat and then indifferently deposited her lifeless form by the roadside. He was later astonished to ascertain her survival of the traumatic experience, yet expressed surprise that the incident had not been reported in the media. This phenomenon occurred because, to express it candidly, no one credited Kelly's account. Her spouse accused her of infidelity and initiated divorce proceedings, while local law enforcement appeared to dismiss the event as a mere domestic dispute, consequently neglecting to conduct a proper investigation into the incident. The legal proceedings against David Parker Ray proved to be protracted and fraught with contention. However, in the year 2001, he consented to a plea agreement stipulating a sentence of 224 years of incarceration for the kidnapping and torture of 3 young females, Cynthia and Kelly being 2 of the aforementioned. Subsequently, on May 28, 2002, David was transported to the Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, for interrogation by state police regarding his participation in various other criminal acts. He succumbed to a cardiac arrest prior to the commencement of the interrogation, collapsing before the attending correctional officers, never to regain consciousness. Ray's daughter, Jessie Ray, was likewise prosecuted on charges of abduction and ultimately received a sentence of 2.5 years of imprisonment, being subsequently released at some point in the mid-2000s. Cindy Hendy, conversely, having become eligible for conditional release in 2017, was eventually set free in the year 2019. This is the identical woman who willingly shattered a lighting fixture upon another individual's cranium merely because they had the audacity to seek liberation from her oppressive sadism, and now she possesses the freedom to traverse the public thoroughfares, the very same pathways frequented by those she elected to exploit. Story 5. The compact community in Wyoming where the narrator resides possesses an ancient, proximate bridge, a structure that, according to all the local children, is said to be supernaturally afflicted. There are no spectral entities present, nor any eerie phantasms that abruptly materialize as one endeavors to traverse it during nocturnal hours. However, the narrator assures the listener that it is indeed haunted, in the sole manner that any location can genuinely be considered so. This is because, a considerable time ago, 2 young females from their community were serendipitously strolling across the bridge when a vehicle, occupied by 2 male individuals, drew alongside them. They inquired if the girls desired transport to their residences, and the girls acquiesced. However, rather than conveying them home, the men perpetrated horrific acts upon the young women. They physically assaulted them, sexually violated them, committing deeds of an utterly atrocious nature. Subsequently, upon the completion of their heinous acts, they cast both girls from the bridge into the turbulent waters beneath. This constitutes a vertical descent of approximately 100 feet, incidentally. No individual could reasonably be expected to survive such a fall into those agitated currents and live to recount the experience, yet astonishingly, by some sheer, inexplicable providence, the elder of the 2 girls was carried by the current to the riverbank several miles downstream, expelling the water from her lungs before limping away to seek assistance. It constituted a profoundly significant news event. While the narrator was merely a child at the time, they recall its repercussions with the vividness of recent memory. The young woman who endured the ordeal ultimately departed from Wyoming, and the narrator states they are not one to fault her for desiring to flee the haunting recollection of such an event. However, then, several years later, she returned. She possessed a husband, or possibly a male companion, but the narrator is certain they had a child with him, and that the child was likely hers. At that juncture, the narrator surmised that she had perhaps simply moved beyond the traumatic events she had endured, and desired for her offspring to be in proximity to their grandparents, or for similar reasons. Every member of the community was pleased by her return. The narrator recalls that much distinctly, and for a period, the compact family unit appeared to be integrating comfortably. Then, on a certain day, the narrator recalls their spouse receiving a telephone call from one of her associates who was employed at the local preschool. The surviving sister and her family had been ambulating near the antiquated bridge, and as her child's father articulated it, 1 minute she was present, the next, she had vanished. She had returned completely to her hometown, accompanied by her newly formed family unit. She possessed every reason to embrace life. Yet, a singular glance at that precipitous drop leading to the river must have caused all those dreadful recollections to flood back into her consciousness. The narrator believes this phenomenon is termed survivor's guilt, a state where one finds it impossible to accept having escaped an event that claimed the life of a beloved family member or close acquaintance. They have heard that this is the identical psychological impetus that compels military veterans to self-harm, a tormenting belief that they are undeserving of life when a cherished comrade never returned home. For the narrator, the events that transpired at that bridge, separated by approximately 2 decades, are more terrifying than any creature from a horror film one could conceive. They are of the opinion that it might even be more unsettling than any actual, real-life serial murderer. The bridge, it seems, summoned her back to itself. The narrator is uncertain of the mechanism, but it undeniably occurred. It is as though she was not truly destined to have endured that initial descent, as if she had, in some way, circumvented mortality. However, ultimately, she surrendered what was predetermined, an unavoidable destiny. Indeed, the narrator concedes they likely dwell upon it excessively, but then questions if they can be justifiably blamed. Perhaps it is not merely the bridge that is supernaturally affected by the past events, perhaps the narrator themselves is also haunted. Promotional content. The speaker extends gratitude to their audience for their attention, encouraging them to activate the notification bell icon to receive alerts for all forthcoming narrative releases. They affirm the publication of new video content each Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, precisely at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Should listeners possess a compelling narrative, they are urged to submit it to the speaker's dedicated subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, with the potential for their account to be highlighted in a subsequent video production. Furthermore, for those desiring to provide enhanced support, early access to all forthcoming narrations and exclusive bonus material is available via Patreon, or alternatively, individuals may click the prominent Join button to discover additional benefits presented for the channel. And explore the Let's Read podcast, where one can access all these compelling stories and extensive compilations, thereby conserving substantial data, accessible on any platform where podcasts are consumed. All relevant hyperlinks are provided in the descriptive section beneath. The speaker expresses immense appreciation to their audience and concludes with a playful reminder that some individuals anticipate 10 inches tonight of snow.